Welcome to the Future Psychiatry Podcast, where we explore novel technology in mental health, psychiatry, and psychology. We speak to guests to better understand their contributions to this space and dig deep into underlying motivations for key features, technical challenges, and future directions. We look behind the curtain to see how these creations were made and how they expect them to evolve in the future. Today, we're speaking with an extraordinary individual, the founder and CEO of MindBank, an artificial intelligence-based app that allows you to create a digital persona or a personal digital twin, as they call it, through the process of answering prompts and then subsequent self-reflection. So, Emil, can you tell me a little bit about your background and how you got started in this field? It seems like a kind of a niche to get involved in.
Sure. Thank you for having me on the show, Bruce. I studied psychology. My mother's a psychologist, and I've always been around in this area, as you can imagine. Growing up with someone in the house, in the home that's their life, right? First as a guidance counselor, then and before that as a teacher. So she's always been in this world. And I went into the psychology field because I was wondering, okay, what do I want to be when I grow up, right? And when I was in my undergrad, I saw that with psychology, you can do a lot of things, right? You can go into business school, you can go to med school. So I said, okay, let me study psychology, and I was always fascinated by the brain, right, and the mind. But as life would turn it, I kind of chose a different career path. I studied later on. I moved into communications industry and went into marketing, which still has a lot of psychological components to it, right, as you can imagine.
Definitely.
And then the twist of fate. When I was in 2020, when my daughter was 4 years old, she had what I would call a transformational moment for me with her on her iPad. And that's really what started and spun off the concept of Mind Bank. I saw her interaction with Siri, right, where she was asking Siri a bunch of questions. And the first one was what really struck a chord with me the most, where she said, Siri, do you have a mommy? And then she continued asking Siri these questions. And at one point she says, Siri, I love you. You're my best friend. And at that moment, I saw that, she went from having a transactional relationship to having an emotional relationship. But you started analyzing it, and in a split second, I just started thinking about what's her future going to be like when she's my
Hmm.
age, and
Right.
how can I always be part of that world, right? The world's going so fast, and ultimately, you start analyzing. Wait, Siri is just an interface to a database. How can I become that database so that my child and my children and my children's children can always have a conversation with daddy, right? And all these, stories that compose our lives. You tell it in word of mouth, but you don't really write it down. You have a few posts here and there on social, but it's those stories of like, how did you meet mommy? How did you end up in Prague? Or how did you go to Miami when you graduate? All these things that compose your life, you tell your kids and you tell your family and friends through word of mouth. But all that data is lost, right? And that's kind of what makes us who we are, really. And I said, we have the technology today to be able to store that data and index that data and extract value from that information. So that's where the story of MindBank came about, where it's like, okay, let me build a platform so that I can store my wisdom and so that my daughter could always have daddy, so it always have access to daddy.
Hmm.
And ultimately, if you think about it, this data can live on forever as your digital twin so that you can have a conversation with this entity. And in the course of this journey, right, before I got this idea January 17th, 2020, and for like 9 months, I was just, you know, letting the idea marinate and talking to people in different industries just to get, a sense of how do I go about doing this. And one of the things that kept popping up was, how to make it engaging. And then at the time, it was COVID time, right? So the only exercise I was getting was going running in the park here and there. And I started realizing, wait a second, when you run and you've got like a Nightgap or Strava, you get that instant data feedback that you ran and you did this many miles and this
Hmm.
much time. And that's kind of what kept you motivated. And those incremental gains in your physiology and your physical fitness is what keeps you coming back. So I was like, wow, we can do that with the mind. And we figured out how to use these algorithmic models to create a dashboard of the mind for lack of a better word, so that you can become much more data driven about your psychology, your personal development. And really what we want to do is move the industry from healthcare to self-care so that people are much more empowered with their mental wellness data.
So I think that was very insightful that you had that revelation when speaking with your daughter when she was mentioning that when she was basically talking to Siri. My son, he's 15 months old now, and his first name that he learned was Alexa. And whenever we mentioned Alexa, he would completely turn his head around and look right at the screen. So he started to learn about her from a very young age.
Mm.
So it makes a lot of sense. And in switching to thinking about the business aspect, who's your target audience right now for this application? I saw that you get involved a little bit in the B2B side as well.
Yeah, definitely. So, when I launched Mindbank, I had a few assumptions, right? We weren't focused on the B2B at all. We were strictly a B2C play. Because I just saw my story, right? And I was like, okay, I can talk, I can understand me and people like me, so let me go on that journey. And we went out and did like I'm a marketing guy, right? So I went out and did market research. I got some feedback in terms of the positioning and all that. And my hypothesis was 35 plus are going to be really interested. And it basically came out to being answered, right? Which is what I call the sweet spot is those who are young enough to have children at home, like yourself, right? And you start remembering what it's like to be a child again, right? These little flashbacks of your childhood start coming when you have small children, right? It's
Mhm,
quite amazing. Yet at the same time, we're starting to take over some responsibility over our parents, right? Whatever that means, So in my case, I help them with their finances and just kind of manage stuff, for them here and there. Take them to the doctor once in a while. These type of situations that you start realizing their time is limited, right? And then you got also start realizing that, this life is so important that's just starting to come into this world. And we're in the middle, literally,
mhm.
right?
Yep.
So that's the sweet spot. The person starts getting that self, actualization of like, okay, I'm a father and a son at the same time, or a daughter. And what have I done with my life? What will I do with my life? How can I leave a legacy for my kids? All these questions start appearing in your life, and that's the sweet spot, right? Because you realize that there's a value to your life, to your information, to your wisdom, and
Mhm.
also to those of your parents, right? You also want to keep a piece of them around as well.
Right. So I saw when using the app, you get a lot of cognitive insights about your personality type. What other insights beyond that does a user hope to gain from that experience of using the app?
Excellent. Yeah. So we started with a framework that people understand, right? So the Big Five framework is what we're measuring now. And we just analyze all of the Big Five traits, and within those, there's another eight each within each traits, like neuroticism and agreeableness and all these things. And the first and foremost, what we're looking for is let's do self-awareness very well. Who are you? Who am I? And how do I develop, right? And what we want to build into this are then the insights into like not only who you are, but who are you, in perspective to someone else? Or why is it that, this level of anxiety is high? Or what can you do about these things, right? So getting more into this insights and help guide people towards self understanding, right? There's also other things that we want to add on to it when it comes to one feature that's coming out. It's actually built already, and it's in our video. It's what we like to call, it's more of a gamification of it, where it's like, how are you in respect to someone else in history, right? So, are you similar to Einstein, or I don't know, Genghis Khan or something or something like that, right? And this is more for engagement once again, right? And so once again, understanding who you are versus someone else and getting these personality types is the first step. We also want to use a personality type as part of the when we develop our, let's say, linguistic models for conversational AI to build a personality into the digital twin, right? So, are you more agreeable? Are you more neurotic? Whatever the case may be, right? What
Right.
was your personality? Because ultimately, that's who we are, right? If
Mhm.
it's not wrong to be neurotic. It's okay.
And how do you set the dial on that though? Is it
Uh,
like a
we
little bit of
don't.
massaging?
We're just measuring that right now. We're not. We're just really straight data,
Oh,
right? We're
gotcha.
in data capture mode. There's no massaging at all. It's just like okay, because we need an aggregate score, and also what's interesting is that people are different when they speak about different topics, right? If you're, I don't know,
And different audiences.
exactly. So if you're speaking, for example, we've done the research. We did an analysis of how people speak on podcasts versus how they write on their blogs.
Hmm.
There is a personality change. There is. It's not like night and day, but you see that there's a shift, really, like I said, if you think about it, it comes down to the fact that you self-edit when you write. You think about what you're going to write, and you come back to it, and however, when you speak, you just speak.
Hmm.
That's your true self, right? And then I'm sure, Bruce, when you speak to your kids, you're not the same as when you speak at work, and so there is these little slight changes. But ultimately, you want to get an aggregate score of okay, how does Bruce talk about work versus family versus religion versus love, right? And we'll start gathering these data. That's why we have it by topic as well, so that we can start gathering this type of information and seeing where it goes, really. It's amazing how, when I started this journey in 2020, how it's developed in the last 2 years. It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's astonishing how fast it's going. I give you an example. When I first started in 2020, doing the desk research, Gartner's hype cycle, if you're familiar with it, right?
Hmm.
They put the digital twin of the person to be a transformational technology within for where 1 to 5% of the world will have a digital twin by 2027, roughly, right? Something about 7 to 10 years, right?
Hmm. In a $182 billion market by 2030 is what I saw.
But that's the new number, right? So the new number now is that last month I spoke to them and actually spoke to them, and they said that the new number is now 15% of the world will have a digital twin by 2024. And it went from 9 billion market size roughly to 182 billion by 2030. And this is just in 2 years. And it's
Why
really,
does society need a digital twin? I think the reason is
I
as a
think
whole.
we're data hungry. I think about our lives, right? Our car, our phone, our websites, like everything is so data driven, right? Except us. Think about that for a second. Except our psychology or in our, let's say, personal development, really. Other than
It's collecting data on us, but we're not actually ever seeing the data,
using it for our own personal development,
right?
right? Other than like your school grades at school, what reference point do you have that you're saying I'm getting smarter, I'm getting better? So there's that whole space of personal data, and not for personal data for privacy reasons. Let's use it as a tool, right? Personal data so that I can become a better human being. What does that mean to me, becoming a better human being? We have tons of data on our physiology, right? I'm wearing an Apple Watch. It's got my heart rate. If I want to know how much my, oxygen I have,
Mhm.
I can do
Sleep,
all that, right?
yep, exercise.
Can it tell me how am I feeling emotionally right now? No,
Mhm.
right? But someone that talks to me can say, "Hey, Emil's having a bad day," right? Or when he speaks about this particular topic, it still hurts him. You see what I mean? And that's the role of a psychologist, really, if you think about it, or a counselor or whatever.
Right.
But how do we make that so that can become, let's say, decentralized from this professional and self-empowered as well, right? Just like we have fitness apps that help us, go run and work out, we also have trainers, right, that help us on that journey. And I think that's the role of Mind Bank, where it's that tool that you can self-care and at the same time provide your professional a lot more data around your psychology that they can, listen into, understand. And quite interesting, Bruce, when we first launched back in March, April this year, I asked a few psychologists that I knew, I was like, hey, give it a spin. They tried it out. They're like, yeah, I said, listen, I think it's a good way to give homework to your patients. Because you see a psychologist once a week, once a month, or whatever the case may be. What about all those other days that they're just still trying to deal
Struggling.
with the issue, right? But what MindBank, I guess what you realize is that you're able to talk to yourself about the issue, document it, reflect on the data, right? And how you interpret the data is up to you, right? If you see the neuroticism is off the charts, like that's you start asking yourself why, like what's going on, and then you start looking at the words that you're using to describe that emotion. And it's in the words, right? Like the way what we say says a lot about who we are. And that's the whole psycholinguistic genre, right? The whole industry, right?
Right. And give us a little insight into that because how do we decipher neuroticism from somebody's tone of voice? Is it the cadence? Is it the pitch? Is it the variability of the pitch? I mean, let's get into the weeds a little bit about where you start when you have a blank canvas. How did you actually build or maybe it's proprietary, but
It's definitely, I won't dive too deep into the let's say the models and stuff, but let's put it this way. There's tons of research out there and around psycholinguistics, right? And uses of pronouns. What's being measured are the actual words. The cadence and that stuff, we're storing the voice file in order to get to that level too, right? What we
okay.
can do right now is measure the speech to text, right? So we take this voice file, convert it to text, and that text gets analyzed for those properties, right? And that's what's being analyzed. The cadence and the pauses in the voice and all of that has a lot of value too. We're just not there as a company yet to start analyzing that deep enough, which is why we're raising this funding round and to build out a team that can specialize in that space as well. Because voice says a lot about your emotional state,
Hmm.
right? The quivers, the pauses, just a
Yep.
pause, right? You know,
Right.
and we have it on the voice file, but we don't have it on the data yet, right? On the analysis. But really, what it comes down to, we measure the actual words and the models create the dashboard.
I think that would be really huge because I remember on some video I was watching there, say you have a simple sentence like, did you take the trash out today? And if you put the emphasis on any one of those words, it's going to change the meaning of it. Did you take the trash out today? Did you take
Exactly.
out the trash today?
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
has a totally different meaning depending on where our intonation is. And so if you just do speech to text, I feel like you are missing an element there, but so you probably graded the words and based on the emotional charge to them after, and then kind of get a
Exactly.
metric based on that number.
Yeah, yeah, and all things like using the words, being more I focused. I did this and I did that versus we or he, or.
Gotcha.
Then you start seeing where are the pronouns and where is the subject and how is that in relation to the topic. So these are the things, and obviously there's aggressive words and I hate it. All these things come out, right? So
Mhm.
that's a measurement as well. So yeah, but and I'm sure like once we start analyzing the voice file, it'll just even become much more richer in that context for sure.
Yeah, that's that's so true. You have a sounds like a huge trajectory in front of you. What is your greatest fear, perhaps, in terms of how maybe it would be misused or maybe people misinterpret the company or the intentions of the company? What do you feel like the purpose is appropriately communicated to our society and to the mass audience who might be using it?
Well, we definitely have a long-term job to do, in that sense, because we have to educate the market. The topic of the digital twin, personal digital twin, is a very new topic. I always tell people it's kind of like about if I like 15 years ago, I was talking to you about cloud computing. You'd be like, "What? We're putting my data up in the cloud? Are you crazy?"
Hmm.
That's exactly what's happening now, and those are the conversations we have, and it's interesting. So the biggest to say fear is data privacy, right?
Hmm.
And because the data we ask is quite private, right? It's very personal stuff. Um,
I think
and
that's a limiting factor too by how much people are going to open up to this app.
Yeah, exactly. But what we do see too is that those who do open up and have a need, right, to open up, they're power users, right? They really dive in and feel comfortable with it because ultimately you've built a trust to the company. And to some extent built a trust to me because my intention is has always been for my daughter, right? So like there's no money in the world that's gonna like take over that. And it's not, I come from a world of marketing too, so I know how it can be misused in that space. So I'll give an example. One of the things on our governance is that I have 100% voting shares. Although we sell shares to the company, when it comes to the business and the vision and the ethics, buck stops here, right? And you need that kind of governance, especially at this stage, because you could easily say, "Oh yeah, we're going to sell the data to make some money," and no, no, that's not my intention. Two, the whole business model is not advertising based, right? Our business model is subscription, and what we really want to do is decentralize this very soon, so that you can become part of the marketplace. So if an opportunity does come that someone wants Bruce's data, I would just say, "Hey, Bruce, this company A wants your data. Would you be willing to pay or sell it to them?"
Hmm.
And now that's your transaction with them,
Hmm.
right? We
It's a
facilitate that
totally different mindset, I feel.
completely different. Yeah, and that's your business, right? That's your data. We just facilitate that transaction. And that's
Hmm.
where we are going with our Web3 migration. So right now we're in the first, we took the first baby step into that. So we actually have a grant from the Definity Foundation that gave us a small grant to start that process. So we've started that process, right? Because that's our short-term goals, not even a long-term. I mean, this is like end of next year is our target to be completely decentralized.
Wow, that's pretty fast. I, on that topic of privacy, I posed this to previous guests that I had. I'm a physician, and when I obtain informed consent, we have this standard that we have to meet where we can assess whether the person understands what they're agreeing to. Medication or procedure, what have you, they need to understand the risk benefit of doing the procedure versus not doing it. And I need to document that understanding is there and they have competence to understand this issue that they have. But in privacy, policies, and I'm guilty of this too. I'll just agree to a privacy policy that I didn't even read. You know, they're 15 pages. I want to start using the service. I'm not going to read through every line. How do we how do we improve this informed consent of our data privacy? I feel like it's just an area that we need to improve upon as a whole to start to rebuild that trust among the tech giants and consumers.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and and it comes down to liability really. When you see these 15 pages, is because of liability issues, right?
Yes.
And I think once that becomes decentralized, so like literally the prototype that we have, the data is yours. It's not like, let's say that transaction that was mentioned before, it's like, Bruce, so company X wants your data from January 1st to February 1st or whatever whatever the date range. So we would make it as simple as possible, right, to be understood. And then the risks would be obviously hopefully outlined as well. And it shouldn't be 15 pages long. If it's 15 pages long, it's too complicated. It seems way too complicated. It should just be this is what you're giving and this is what you're getting. It's a transaction, right? But it's we're in the in the primordial soup of this of of this space right now when it comes to this. But fundamentally, right? Fundamentally, it comes down to ownership, right? Who owns the data? Keep in mind, you use TikTok, you use Facebook, use all those apps. The owners of the data are those companies, right? And that's the shift that's happening where we need to respect, the ownership of the data is not mine banks or shouldn't be mine banks, should be Bruce's. I call it we're the guardians of that data, right? That's kind of even on our mission statement, vision statement is like we want to be the world's most trusted guardians,
Mhm.
not owners, right? Guardians. There's a very big difference between the two. It's about protection and guidance, right? Not ownership, right? And but that's that's a it's the whole industry is it's moving in that direction because it has to. People are wanting it. And lastly, the technological infrastructure is at a place that it can be there, right? Remember before, this whole blockchain and Web3 didn't even exist for us to even get to this stage. And even today, it's still too early for us to do a complete migration, right? The infrastructure is not there. We're literally building these things out, you know?
Mhm.
In order to get to this space because it's so new and hopefully we do it in a way that it doesn't break a year
Yeah.
from now, you know? And so you got to kind of like literally the way we see it is a bit like this, right? We're here, we're transitioning into something like that, right? And there's going to be a bit of an overlap
Mhm.
and then eventually it'll just be that Web3 decentralized journey. It's a transition, it's not an evolution, right?
What has been the biggest surprise to you, either from a business aspect, a technical aspect? I'm sure there's been a lot, but what is the most interesting surprise that you've had on this journey where you've had to pivot perhaps, or you've encountered some sort of challenge and needed to come up with a solution you weren't expecting?
Yeah, I guess there's a few. The first one is the uptake in B2B interest was the first one. Right, and that's kind of back to the conversation. I started as a B2C company, but then, all these B2B conversations started happening and I was like, okay, this is interesting. So that's an interesting, and we have at least 10 to 15 companies on pilots, pretty soon. We're going from two languages to 20 by the end of in like about a week and a half.
Wow.
Right.
So
So
global interest,
oh,
essentially.
very global interest. Yeah, yeah, and it's and it comes also from my background, right? I've lived in Prague, Czech Republic for the last 17 years in Europe, and obviously when you live in Europe, Germany's 3 hours, Austria, Poland is next door, and you have this multilingualism already. And also when you do these businesses in Germany or rather business in Europe, you have to have at least five, six languages in your product because
Mhm.
everything is fractured in that sense. Whereas in the US, it's one language, maybe two with Spanish, right, and then you're done. But the rest of the world is not like that, right? You need to really to internationalize. You need to do multilingualism, and also from my backstory, I speak six languages myself.
Wow.
I understand. I've always said it that language is a window into their culture, right? And back to this whole psycholinguistics,
Yeah.
it's a fascinating field because you start when you speak a lot of languages, right? And in my case, I was born bilingual practically, right? You understand that the way one culture thinks and the way that another culture thinks, and then like I learned Czech, right, which is a very different language structure and everything else, Slavic based. And then as I was learning Czech, I was like, the psychologist in me was like, oh my God, I get it, why they're the way they are, like
Interesting.
it's in the language, the way it's structured. says so much about the cultural heritage and the way people act and the way they think. And I don't want to say group thinking, but there is a group think into a culture, right? That's what makes it a culture.
Yes.
Shared history, shared background, shared language. So I think it's very important that MindBank is multilingual. Also, because I don't want it to be another technological divide, right? This technology has an impact, has a potential to impact humanity tremendously. And, we always look at the world from Anglo-Saxon eyes almost,
Hmm.
right? Whereas, someone who,
Western perspective.
yeah, Western perspective and stuff. Um, um, when you start looking at languages and culture, it's important to be accessible in French, Spanish, Portuguese, Portuguese from Portugal, Portuguese from Brazil, right?
Yeah.
All these little nuances, Arabic, and you've got Egyptian Arabic, and you've got, Saudi, all these different languages. So we'd want to be as global as possible. And once again, like I mentioned, the market's going to blow up. If we want to capture 15% of the market by 2024, we have to go into multilingualism today.
Hmm. I appreciate that. That's kind of just made my mind race and all the potential follow-up questions that I have, but we don't have time for. It's a very interesting topic. I feel like there could be a whole podcast episode about how the cultural variations of communication and how
Oh,
that would
there's
impact
so many.
AI and
Yeah.
psycholinguistics analysis.
And we're getting into that field, right? We're gonna hopefully, Bruce, in about a year or two, I'll come back with some data and say, hey, Bruce, this is
Yeah,
what
yeah.
we found out in the last year. Let's see. But I know from my personal story that there's a lot of difference, that for sure. There's an impact there.
So what makes you most excited about the field of mental health in this AI space?
What really helps, what really gets me excited, this whole concept that we have of moving the industry from healthcare to self-care. Really, what I mean by that is like empowering people to be much more self-aware, right? And if you look at our history as humans, we have religion and we had all these different structures of society to help us in our journey, right? To develop as a child, to develop as a young man, to develop as an adult. And we have these rituals. But once in the modern world, all these things started coming off and being replaced by, pop culture and these other things, right? So I think the technology has a chance now to, or at least Mindbank has a chance now to help us go back to that self-awareness, right? If you think of prayer, if you think of these rituals of becoming, like cultures have the walkabout, all of these are ritualistic behavior that help us in our development. And I think Mindbank has a way of, in a micro way of helping people be much more self-aware and hopefully, help you learn about yourself so that you can, enhance your humanity. I like to call it AI enhanced humanity. How can
Mhm.
we embrace AI to become a better human being?
I like that. So thank you very much for joining me today and speaking with me, Emil. It was a pleasure. I think we're going to have to follow along on your journey of this interesting self and holistic discovery that you have going on here. I think you're a thought leader in this field, and you're going to be paving the way for the other individuals and companies in this space in the future.
Thank you for having me. It was great, Bruce. It's good fun.